Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first topic here of Unit 1. We're going to talk today about the global market for players. Now, mostly we're going to talk about soccer in this lecture, but it applies equally to any sport that has a truly global market, which then applies mostly to basketball, baseball, and hockey in addition to soccer. So the rest don't have enough of a global market. In other words, enough countries you can go play in for it to matter. But with soccer having so many places you can go play, so many different clubs at different levels, then it becomes a truly global market. For example, there is a number of clubs that were involved in transferring soccer players in 2011. In a 2-month period, more than 2,000 soccer clubs transferred a player from one club to another. So that truly makes it a global market because you have clubs across the whole world. And the market is one that any place seems better than one place or another. What I mean is sometimes we talk about, say, a flow of Brazilians going to play in Europe. But there's also a flow where the Brazilian league is stronger than some other regional league. So an Ecuadorian player may leave to go play in Brazil. Other Ecuadorians may go play in Europe as well. But that whole idea is that there may be this pull away from one place, but it also transfers in. And there's a link I'll give you that shows transfers from one place to another over time that you can follow and poke around. It's not a required thing, but just to explore what the global market looks like. Where we really want to start talking about a global market, though, is with the foundation of something called the European Economic Community in 1957. We're really looking here at what would be considered the most significant legal decision in regards to sport of all time. It was something ruled by the High Court of the European Union that's based on the legislation held in the Treaty of Rome. So the European Community, European Economic Community is the forerunner of the European Union. You probably heard of the European Union. This is an IGO. Remember way back in Unit 1 when we talked about IGOs. It's comprised of currently 26 member states in Europe, and there's candidate states that may grow by the time you listen to this or watch this. And there's also some countries talking about maybe withdrawing. But the basic idea is that these 26 states are intertwining as closely as they can for a variety of reasons. But the overarching reason is because they had hundreds of years of warfare in Europe. And they came to the decision after World War I and World War II that they would bind themselves as closely together as they needed to so that they would avoid the temptation to go to war with one another. Essentially, you overcome the desire to fight the other when it hurts you to go to war against them. That's sort of the desire. You intertwine the most. Now, sometimes people lose sight of this overarching goal when immediate concerns strike them. For example, a banking concern or monetary concern, economic crises of other sorts may tempt them into thinking that maybe the EU is not the greatest thing or the common currency isn't the greatest thing. But the overarching idea is they don't want to fight anymore. The Treaty of Rome did something very interesting. One of the things it did was make a single, unified, common labor market. This is key for us in our conversation. So what they basically said was that anybody who is in the European Economic Community had the right to go work in any other EEC member state without any additional passports or visas or anything, because they were going to have that free exchange of labor. So if you were in the treaty, you could pick up and go and move from one place to another. Anybody in any labor. However, labor in the sporting world is odd. And labor in the sporting world in the United States is odd as well, not just in Europe. At issue is this, is your contract versus your rights to a player. So in the United States, for example, you'll be familiar with what happens when a draft for football, basketball, baseball, hockey, etc. is held. Right? So they look at the pool of eligible amateur players, and then they set up their own structure for selecting those players, usually in reverse order of your finish in the previous season. And the teams take turns selecting the rights to a player. What that means is that a normal college graduate in any pool, any field, has the right to negotiate with any employer they want to. But in sports, they don't have that right. If they're picked by a team in a draft, the rights belong to the team. You don't own your own labor rights in the sporting realm. It's really quite strange. So, yes, it was neat to see Mike Iupati, who was a lineman for the University of Idaho, get drafted by the San Francisco 49ers and help lead them to a Super Bowl. But he didn't have the right to negotiate with all NFL teams. He was picked by the San Francisco 49ers. As long as his contract held, contract he signed with them, and that some of it was pre-negotiated, he didn't have the choice to go anywhere else. The way it works in soccer, and worked in soccer, prior to something called the Bosman ruling, was that you signed a contract with a team. An individual signed a contract with a team. Now, we'll talk a bit more about how you get to that contract level. But you sign the contract to the team. And if the contract was, say, for 3 years, at the end of those 3 years, you did not become a free agent. that in fact the team held on to your rights, and they could sell them to another team if they wanted to, and that other team would then own your rights, but you didn't control them yourselves. Even when you were no longer under contract, the right was held in perpetuity. So a Belgian player named Jean-Marc Bosman sued. First, he sued his club. He sued the Belgian league. He sued UEFA, which is the regional IF for Europe, and he sued FIFA. He sued for the right to control his own labor when he was not under contract. So this was a big deal because he's challenging the sporting rules, and all the different sporting organizations argued that he could not decide for himself, right? That his labor was bound. But he argued that under the Treaty of Rome, he had the right to his own labor. He had the right to move to any other EEC member state without anyone's control or care. So this is the question: does a sporting bingo have the right to affect political policy? Can they supersede an agreement between other places? And sometimes you'll see that there are exceptions granted to U.S. law, for example, on antitrust violations or rules and stuff like that. We give rights for them to get out of jail free, or to have the law not apply to them. And that was the question that Bosman had. And it took several years, but he won. He had court cases against all of those, and he went to the High Court of the European Union. And he had rights granted to him to control his own labor and sign his own contract. Now, by the time it came through and he actually won, he was a pretty old player. He didn't have much of a career left, but a lot of other people do have that right now, and they move from one country to another. That's a little bit complicated by something called player registration cards. So essentially, you have a card that registers you with a team in a league. So you have that transfer certificate that is required to be justified or tried to claim to move between one country and another. So this is one for a player named Paulo Vinicius Sousa dos Santos to move from a team in Argentina. He's actually himself this is a team in Uruguay to move to Hungary. Now this is a Brazilian player. Sousa dos Santos is a Brazilian name. He was playing in Uruguay. He wanted to move to play in Hungary, and so you have to file this with FIFA. What FIFA is going to check is all the contracts and who the money is going to pay who. What that means is this: is an international transfer. If you're on a Bosman, if you're on a free, basically meaning your contract has expired and you can move, then you can just go and sign. But if you're going to try and transfer where there's a fee involved, you still have that process where clubs try and get something for a player before his contract is up. Will try and sell him. They don't trade internationally, but they sell the rights to that player. So in this case, you may have the Uruguayan team in Uruguay selling the right to the Hungarian Football Federation, who will then assign the right to a particular club. Okay, this is confusing. It's curious because in a lot of parts of the world, particularly in the developing world, there's a process of buying shares in a player's stock, for lack of a better word. What it means essentially is that as a player is developed and somebody puts money into that player, he has a registration card with an agent, a league, a team, a club, a federation, and people can buy shares of it, so that you can get to a point where a young player who's now turning 20 or 21 could have 4 or 5 or 6 claimants on his card that then has to be vetted through the international transfer certificate process. Who's going to make sure that everyone who owns a piece of that player agrees and gets the share of the money that they're entitled to. So if you basically own a 20% share in the player's registration card, then when the international transfer certificate comes through, you get that much money paid back to you. What essentially I'm trying to get to the point is that players don't control their own labor. And there's a complex interaction of domestic labor law or interregional labor law like you have in the EEC, intermixing with FIFA rules, the Bingo's rules, and trying to figure out how it all works internationally. It leads to a question, though, with this transfer of players, is to what's European and what's not. For example, the UEFA Cup, that's a global competition, sorry, not global, a regional competition that happens every year, where you start basically in May of one year with the preliminary games all the way till June of the following year for the final game of the next title, where you play down to have the crowned champion of European football. Here's the starting lineup that Internazionale of Italy ran out in 2010, and you'll see that their players were not from Italy. On the bench, they had some Italian players, and in fact, there was an Italian who came in and played a minute of stoppage time. But other than that, the other 13 players who participated in the game were from all parts of the world. Primarily, if you'll notice, Latin America with several other European states and a couple of other states thrown. Its question is to whether this is a European game or a global game. If that's European soccer, then maybe it's actually global soccer with people playing in Europe because that's the place where most players go. There's new money in this old game. It's really curious as to who comes in. So you used to have like English football, right? The teams are owned by English owners. They played English players, etc. But now you have big, huge owners like this is Roman Abramovich, who owns Chelsea. He's a former oil tycoon in Russia. And you have some sheikhs and some others who are buying up teams. American rich people, the Glazer family, who owned the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, bought Manchester United. Manchester United, you'll notice, is sponsored at a rate of, I got to remember what the rate was, $53 million a year for 7 years. That's an American automobile company paying $53 million to have the right to have their advertisement on each of the Manchester United jerseys, replica that fans buy and what the teams wear. That's new money in this old game, but it means it's not totally European or certainly not totally domestic when Americans are buying English teams and American teams or companies are sponsoring. You had Middle Eastern airlines are also major sponsors. So you got lots of money coming from all over the place here into this old game. How this plays in the United States, there was a lawsuit by a guy named Ian Fraser and a couple other MLS players in 1996 who contended that MLS in its single entity, that there was one U.S. Major League Soccer, right, one league that controlled all the contracts. Now, what they try and do is they try and opposite a single entity. You sign your contract with the team instead of with a player. Their lawsuit faltered when MLS countered and argued that there wasn't just only one league in the United States, that soccer players are actually part of a global market. They said, no, we can control your salary levels here in the United States because they don't have to only play here, then go play in all these other places. That it's not a single market. It's a single global market, not a single national market. So there's your list of your average salaries in the world's major football leagues. That's as of November 2014. So the MLS would say, you can go play all these other places if you'd rather. You don't have to stay in MLS. Well, there's an unscrupulous side to this, as I'm sure you can imagine. You're talking about multiple people owning a player's transfer certificate. You're talking about people trying to get players to go play in other countries. There's opportunities abound, and a lot of that's in those places that pay more money than others. There's a great anecdote in the beginning of a book about Brazilian soccer, written by a guy named Alex Bellos, who talks about the dream of these Brazilians to sign to play in Europe. And it opens with this case study, these three guys signing to play in Europe, and they end up in the Faroe Islands, which is this Danish possession that sits between Norway and Iceland. Yep, that's Europe, but it's not what those guys were thinking of when they imagined they were going off to play in Europe. I'm going to have you watch a documentary called Soccer's Lost Boys about these transfer certificates, these player control player cards, and people being tricked into coming to Europe for this big payday and being really taken advantage of in pretty heinous ways. So the unscrupulous side is pretty serious, and it's something that you'll want to explore as well. It's about a 45-minute documentary that's got some moments of humor, but it's a pretty depressing film to look at what transpires with these guys who think they're headed for that big payday. What does this all mean? Well, one of the things it means is that there's fewer players from your own state playing in your own league. For example, in 1992, this is before the Bosman ruling, in England, about 5% of all players in the English Premier League, 5% of those players were players from outside of England. That's 1992. The Bosman ruling comes into play, and as of 2010, somewhere between 70 and 80% of all players playing in England were from outside England. So the question is really tricky here because there's a desire to you have the local IF, or the national IF, whose job it is to oversee club soccer, youth soccer, national team soccer. Their job is to prepare the national team. The job is also to oversee the club game. So what's the relationship with the health of the club game and the health of the national team? In other words, if you stop giving the opportunities to your national team players to play in your domestic club teams, as that domestic league becomes better, then maybe you're hurting your national team. And it's a question that pervades in Europe all the time, is what's the relationship between those two things? And that article I have assigned for this unit will give you some interest into what FIFA tries to do about it and what different leagues try and do about it. One of the tricks is they have to fall within their own domestic labor laws, because the domestic labor laws or the regional labor laws in the European Union, those are important unless they get granted exceptions to the courts. The soccer rules, even though players don't control their own labor, they don't control their own destiny the way you and I might, they have to still work within those systems unless they're granted some exception.